Hi, everyone. This is Nick Cap, and this is going to be your biology few moments. This is the 15-minute wrap up of what happened on lecture today. Today was 01/24/22. It is the start of week 2. It's Monday. We're hopefully going to be covering chapters number 22 on evolution and chapter number 23, which is looking at a population. Do your flip grid. I'm going to share my screen here in order for us to take a look at it. This is the canvas that we're looking at. We're looking at week 2. For if we go down to week 2, I have published the syllabus that's still up here. Do your flip grid. I'm going to ask you to actually apply for a biology job. This is how I'm going to get to know you. So basically 3 minutes, go ahead and do your flip grid. I have some links here to chapters number 23, 24, 25, etc. That we are going to be looking at. Today is Monday, and this is the 15-minute wrap up for that. We are going to be looking at the scientific methods in there. And so our next best thing, I'm going to do this. I'm going to stop share. All right, I'm going to share again. And here's the 15-minute wrap up of our basically ecology. Not ecology, evolution. Basically, there's your book gives you this kind of really great, figure 22.2 gives you this really great chronology of what's going on in kind of evolutionary thought. Some of the big guns that we're thinking about are Darwin and his essay on what we call descent with modification. Basically, Darwin, if we look at the scientific method, which we covered in kind of chapter 1, Darwin has a number of observations that he's working on. Number 1, members of a population always often vary in their inherited traits. Again, we look at these beetles. These all look like ladybugs, but if you look at them, there's little differences. There's variation in there. Observation number 2 is all species can produce more offspring than the environment can support, and many of these offspring fail to survive and fail to reproduce. And so again, he make an inference. And the idea here is the inference is, observations can kind of lead to some hypotheses or inferences. An inference is a conclusion based on your evidence or reasoning. Hypothesis is proposed explanation on the basis of that kind of limited inference. So again, inference number 1, we say individuals whose inherited traits give them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing in a given environment tend to leave more offspring than other individuals. So all individuals leave a bunch of more offspring than they need, but ideally ones that are better suited to an environment are going to have more of their offspring reproduce. Inference number 2, this unequal ability of individuals to survive and reproduce will lead to an accumulation of favorable traits in that population over time. So if we do this enough time, then we are going to get things that are adapted to that environment. And so again, Darwin looked at evolution, and he has basically kind of 4 types of data that support evolution. And this is direct observation. And again, you're going to need to know examples of direct observation from your book or from discussions that we've had in class. We will also look at homology and evolution. Basically, evolution is modifying things that you have there. And so again, your ancestral your ancestor has to have something that evolution modified or worked on. We tend to look at the fossil record of what we look at, and we look at biogeography, and that's not as much. And this is the classic picture of what we call this homology adaptation. And so if we look at the 4 limbs of many of our vertebrates, humans, cat, whales, and bats, we all use our arms differently. And again, when we look at these arms, our arms came from kind of this ancestor that had a humerus, a radius, and ulna, and the phalanges. And so if we look at these bones are all similar to one another, and that they work. They come from kind of the same thing. Okay. Sharing. I am recording. I'm going to share my screen. Why am I having trouble with this? And oh, that's the end. that's it. So let's go on to the next thing. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to go on my next. So, so we are going to share the screen again. And this is the second part of the 15-minute wrap up, which is looking at the evolution of populations. And this is the slideshow that we have here. So this is looking good. And basically, population, a group of individuals, same genus, species, that can mate with one another is basically, that's called a population. And that's basically what your smallest unit of evolution is going to be. And so a common misconception is that individual organisms evolve, but that's not the case. Those organisms are adapting. Natural selection acts on individuals. So an individual can either produce offspring or not produce offspring, but it's only a population. And we're looking at that population over time that does the evolution. And so, you know, again, your book does a really good job at like kind of starting out materials with a story. And basically in the starting story that your book has is you're looking at a population of ground finches, and beaks will allow ground finches to actually access different food. And so what we saw is during times of drought, the bigger, harder fruits are more available than kind of the smaller fruits. And what we see is that you would get birds that would develop, you know, several generations. You would get birds that would have this kind of larger beak that will allow them to access that fruit. Again, microevolution is changing allele frequency of the population of generations. There's three main mechanisms that cause the allele frequency change, and these are the things that we need to know about. Number one is natural selection. Number two is genetic drift. And number three is gene flow. Again, only natural selection causes this kind of adaptive evolution. Genetic drift and gene flow are different things, but they can cause changes. So this is one of the, you know, some of the newer amounts that newer ideas that came out since Darwin. And basically all this deals a lot with what we call genetic variation. And genetic variation among individuals is caused by, sorry about that. Genetic variation in individuals. My screen is popping up, but that's okay. All right. Genetic variation we tend to see in individuals where they'll have kind of a different set of genes. Your phenotype is the product of your kind of genotype, what genes that you have in those environmental influences that I had on there. So your book has some neat pictures where they talk about how organisms can change a little bit, you know, and that'd be maybe something like a bonsai tree that you can kind of adapt to that area. Natural selection can only act on variation with the genetic component. So if you don't have variation, if you don't have mutations, you're not going to have natural selection. And so if we do this, in natural selection, we tend to see that on average about one mutation in every 10,000 genes kind of per generation that we see. So it's relatively low, but you know, 10,000 genes you will see in a population. In a population, so this is a table here that's talking about the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And in order to have the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, you have to have a population that's not evolving. And so in a population that's not evolving, you wouldn't have any mutations. In a population that's not evolving, you would have kind of non-random mating. So in random mating is basically where individuals don't pick out a mate, stuff like that. And we tend to see a lot of times, especially in the larger organisms, there will be some selection on that. In a non-evolving group, you have no natural selection. You're going to have an extremely large size, so all things are random, and then you'll have no gene flow. And so these are basically what we could talk about. These are all conditions that kind of favor evolution. Natural populations can evolve when at some loci will be being in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium at other loci. And so again, when we look at the genes, certain genes can evolve and definitely change over time, where certain genes can be in a little bit more natural state. The natural selection causes what we call adaptive evolution. This is a process by which traits that enhance survival or reproduction increase in frequency over time. In genetic drift, this is slightly different. This is where we see a small sample, and this can also be sample error where genetic drift describes how allele frequencies fluctuate unpredictably from one generation to the next. Genetic drift tends to reduce genetic variation through random loss. And so in case here, if just by chance you tend to have these flowers that are next to one another mate with one another, you may see the next generation come up with basically all red flowers. And so in this genetic drift, you're just seeing just a random chance allows something to happen. In the bottleneck effect, this is where you have a relatively large population goes through a small population and then gets a little bit larger again. And so again, as a resulting pool may no longer be reflective of the original population's pool. And so again, we have this bottle here that has red and white and yellow inside of here, and we have it go through a bottleneck event, right? So you just get some of these samples, and the surviving population doesn't have any yellow, and the ratio of blue to red, so blue to white, is actually different. And so this is what we call a bottleneck effect. Gene flow consists of the movement of alleles along population. Alleles can be transferred through the movement of fertile individuals or gametes. Birds tend to do this real easy because they fly about, and then it's a little bit harder for other organisms. And so basically you have to have movement of evolution, movement of individuals. Natural selection is the only mechanism that can cause adaptive evolution. Evolution by natural selection involves both chance and sorting, and so we tend to see this. And so in evolution, we have a fair amount of chance, and their new genetic variations can arise by chance, and these beneficial alleles are sorted for favorable aspects by natural selection. Only natural selection consistently increases the frequencies of alleles that produce a reproductive advantage. And so we're not going to see that in bottleneck, we're not going to see that in drift, et cetera, et cetera. Again, there's a reason why you may ask is why can't natural selection fashion perfect organisms? And, again, you may see organisms in the bay. We have these, crabs that are in the bay where we have these invasive species that are able to come in and take it over. And you may say, well, why aren't the crabs that are there? Aren't they they've evolved in that area to be there? Shouldn't they have it? Again, the reason why is because natural selection can only act on existing variations. Can't introduce anything new. It's not causing it. It's what's the best of there. Evolution is limited by historical constraints. Adaptations are also, maybe a lot of times they are compromises. There's always a compromise to be had. So if you're shaped like a leaf, that's going to cause you some effect on your body, right, to be able to do around. Chance, natural selection, and environment all interact to give us what these organisms are. So that has been our kind of wrap up for today. I hope you enjoyed the 15-minute wrap up and the idea of kind of what's important for these particular two chapters, chapter 2 and chapter 23, chapter 22 and chapter 23. I hope you are able to get online and do the flip grid for this, and I will see you all on Wednesday.